Welcome to the Brain Matters webinar. I'm Dick Moberg, your host for today's presentation. Our featured panelist is Sharon Jewell, who will be talking about spreading depolarizations in the injured brain. This topic is gaining considerable interest as it moves from research into routine clinical practice at quite a few institutions. Sharon and her colleagues at King's College in London are pioneers in this revolution. In our industry partners section, you'll hear from Dr. Ana Rodriguez on how we are involved in both the research and clinical needs of spreading depolarization. As usual, we will first review a few upcoming meetings and deadlines, and then get right into our recorded presentations. At the end, we will have a live question and answer session with our panelists, so please type in your questions using the Q&A tab on your screen anytime during the presentation. Now let's quickly look at upcoming meetings. All of these meetings are listed in the events section on our website, www.moberg.com. Coming up, we have the International Brain Injury Association meeting in Toronto, the Houston Neuro ICU Symposium, followed by the Atlantic Overlook Neuro Conference. The Pediatric Academic Society meeting is in Baltimore in late April this year. We were at that meeting last year, and there were quite a lot of good neuro presentations. It's followed by the Neonatal ICU Leadership Forum in Arizona. Then in May, we welcome you to our home city, Philadelphia, for the American Academy of Neurology. Now, I want to spend a few seconds talking about this meeting. Some people still think this is what the convention center looks like in Philly, and they think we only eat cheesesteaks. But Philly's a very vibrant city. Think of it this way. If New York City were a sweater, and you mistakenly threw it in a dryer and it shrunk, that's Philly. We have a little bit of everything. And May is a great time to visit. So if you plan to attend the AAN, let us know. We can help you with recommendations for a good restaurant or a fun bar. We are also starting to plan a get-together for those hardcore multimodal neuromonitoring folks. So please contact us if you plan to attend. And now a few abstract deadlines. Here's the list. I won't read it. Check them out on our recording of this webinar, which will be on our website in a few days after the broadcast. This is a good time to remind you about our newsletter, the Neuroscience Monitor, which will keep you up to date in neuromonitoring. Your colleagues can sign up anytime on our website. If you have an event or news item related to neuromonitoring and neurocritical care, please send it to us. And finally, check out our website newsletter for the next topic in Brain Matters. We plan to stay on a monthly schedule in 2019. If you have an idea for a topic, please get in touch with us. So today's panelist is Sharon Jewell from King's College and Imperial College in London. We've enjoyed a wonderful relationship over several years with Sharon and her colleagues, and we look forward to our future collaborations with her. And many of us recently received an email notice for the Neurocritical Care Society meeting to find Sharon featured prominently on the front page. She's a star in and out of the hospital. So let's get started with her presentation.
Okay, so I'd just like to begin by saying thank you very much to Dick Moberg and the Moberg team for inviting me to give today's presentation on spreading depolarizations in the injured human brain. And generally, for just putting on these webinars, which are a really great resource for all of us. So I'm going to be talking to you today about brain injury depolarizations, but I would just like to begin by talking a little bit more broadly for a minute so that we can put SDs into the context to which they belong. Now, one of the biggest factors to contribute towards outcome following a brain injury, as we well know, is the development of secondary injury. And one of the best weapons that we actually have against secondary injury is neuromonitoring. However, there are only, in fact, actually a couple of things that we can monitor. We can monitor the things that we believe to be aggravating the injury, or we can monitor the thing that's actually being injured, the neurons. And when it comes to monitoring the neurons themselves, the only real tool that we actually have is neuroimaging. And when it comes to prevention of secondary deterioration, imaging has got a horrible time resolution, so it's really not the best tool. In an ideal world, really what we want is something that sits along a scale of cellular wellness, something that will tell us in real time when active destruction of the tissue is ongoing, and wherever possible will provide us with some feedback upon the effectiveness of our interventions in preventing that. Well, this is the thing. SDs share an inverse relationship with cellular wellness. They themselves actually cause active destruction and cellular deterioration, and they also enter into what can only really be described as a dance of death with other established secondary insults. And we shall see as we go on through this talk how it is that SDs inflict so much damage and how they can amplify and probably even mediate the adverse effects of other secondary insults. And so we're going to begin our story then today at the beginning. So SDs are getting a bit of press lately as the new kid on the block, but in fact they're actually not a new phenomenon. Originally discovered in 1944 by a then unknown PhD student, Aristides Leo, who was working on the mechanisms of Jacksonian seizures, and he got distracted by this creeping suppression that he kept seeing moving across the EEG. And he termed this spreading depression. And he went on, in fact, to investigate the mechanisms of spreading depression and realized that what was causing this was a massive depolarization of a very large population of cells. And he also went on to study what happens in cerebral ischemia and realized that very, very similar to spreading depolarization that's coupled to spreading depression, that a fundamental response of the cortex to severe focal ischemia is persistent depolarization. And he reasoned that there probably was, in fact, a relationship between persistent depolarization, which denotes the infarct core, and a transient depolarization, which is coupled with spreading depression. However, in the years that followed, despite numerous experimental studies showing that spreading depression-like events occur spontaneously in regions surrounding an infarct core, and in fact they are actually correlated with an evolution in that infarct core, it was really some time before translation went on into the clinical setting. And it wasn't until 2002 when Professor Anthony Strong convincingly showed for the first time that much like experimental models, spreading depression, or as it was then called, spreading depression-like events, in fact also occur spontaneously in the human brain. And really that was the first point at which the clinical world really, began to realize what kind of the role that SDs had in the evolution of secondary injury in human stroke and trauma. And his discovery triggered the formation of the COSBIT group, which is a group, or as Prof in his own words would say, was originally a traveling group of enthusiasts, which began as just a very, very small team of clinicians and scientists, and has now in fact grown into a very large body. And we work very closely, the clinical people such as myself to some extent, with our experimental colleagues, because there really is quite a lot of translatability from bench to bedside and bedside to bench with SDs, because the way in which they behave and their characteristics are remarkably similar between experimental models and human patients. And so inherent to the depolarization process then is a massive influx of sodium and calcium and a massive efflux of potassium, the net effect of which is, as alluded to, a massive depolarization and an almost complete collapse of membrane potential. Now, this can be recorded extracellularly as a large negative voltage shift, and because of this massive depolarization, we get a complete cessation of normal activity and all synaptic transmission silences. Now, from a clinical monitoring point of view, it's not very easy to record ionic fluxes in and out of single units, and we can't use patch clamp techniques. And to be honest, it wouldn't be particularly informative to study the behaviour of a single cell in the context of brain injury anyway. But what we can do is record the extracellular potentials and what happens if cell activity silences from populations of cells. And in fact, we can do that fairly readily by placing EKG electrodes. So these are essentially just EEG electrodes, but they're designed to go on the surface of the brain. And we place those on tissue which we deem to be viable but at risk of secondary deterioration, as we can see here. And so then if we connect that EKG electrode to an amplifier in which we are able to record all frequencies, so that just simply means we don't modify the signal in any way, what we get is very similar to the experimental setting, a large extracellular negative shift in the baseline. And this is basically the same as what we get experimentally. And I'm just going to stop for a minute because my own background is in neurophysiology, and I still have to stop even now and just try to get my head around the sheer magnitude and duration of this event. So this particular SD, which I'm showing here, is almost 20 millivolts in size, and it's going on, for several minutes. And this is orders of magnitude beyond anything which we see in the normal EEG situation. I mean, we don't even talk in millivolts, we talk in microvolts. So this really is, it is the biggest brainwave that we know of that's recordable from humans, and it really is quite staggering. And if we filter out that slow potential, which just enables us really to be able to see the depression a little bit better, what we find is really consistent with the experimental situation is that a cessation of normal activity, and in particular the silencing of postsynaptic potentials, which actually gives rise to your EEG, creates this kind of depression in correlation with this negative DC shift that we see. Now, it's important just to note for anybody that might be interested in adopting SD monitoring that not filtering out slow signals does present a little bit of a challenge because the baseline can wobble around a little bit. And that's a fairly easy challenge to overcome, because what we can in fact do is cut out the very, very low frequency. So that just simply means instead of recording right the way down to DC, we just put a very, very, very low high pass filter on, and we just filter out the signal below 0.005 hertz, as I'm doing here. Now that does have the effect of making the signal a little bit smaller, and we end up with effectively a derivative of the real event. But what you'll see is that this signal is still about 8 millivolts. So you're just really not going to miss this. And because the depression really, this is basically your normal EEG frequencies, that is very much recorded in the same way. So we can kind of gain the best of both worlds. We can monitor our DC shift fairly well, and we can even see it online by just putting a little bit of a filter in there to cut out the wobbling of the baseline. And as the name suggests, whatever recording situation you use, the SD propagates between one recording electrode in the next, and hence the term spreading depolarization. So the question really then is, well, why bother? Why on earth would we be interested in actually going to this effort of recording SDs in the first place? Well, it boils down to this. The cells can't stay depolarized forever. They have actually got to repolarize if they ever want to go back to functioning normally again. And the best way to sort of describe how energetically demanding that process of repolarization actually is with this analogy, which is originally dreamed up by Jens Dreyer from the charity. And I do just think it's a really nice illustration of what happens during an SD and how that plays out in terms of metabolic workload and compared to other physiological and pathological processes that we know to go on in the brain. So our neurons then are a little bit like a skier. They start out fully charged, ready to go skiing. And much like the process of a skier slipping down a mountain, this isn't particularly costly. So for a cell to depolarize, it's not all that energetically demanding. But what is demanding is getting back up the hill. And that's the same for normal workload as it is with anything else. And so even under normal circumstances, this depolarization and repolarization, which gives rise to sort of normal general activity, is quite costly. If you have a seizure, then you slip a little bit further down the mountain, and the amount of energy required to fully recharge and go back to behaving normally is quite substantially higher. The problem is that what happens during a depolarization is that the cells depolarize all the way to the point at which they're basically now at the brink of death. And the energy demand to recover from that is absolutely enormous. Now, pretty similar to the skier who's hanging at the edge of death here, there really is only two ways that he's going to go. They're either going to recover, go back to being charged and begin to ski up and down the mountain and return to normal cellular function, or they're just going to slip into the valley of death. And one of the things that will determine which way he goes is, of course, in fact, how long he spends hanging around down there. And so it is with depolarizations. The amount of time spent in a depolarized state is directly correlated to the volume of the lesion expansion. And importantly, this effect is cumulative. So it's not just to do with the amount of time that the cells spend depolarized on a single occasion, it's to do with the amount of times that they're constantly bombarded with this huge metabolic demand. And this is important because what happens following a brain injury, for example, if a vessel becomes occluded and focal ischemia develops, is that a region of functionally and metabolically challenged tissue, the so-called penumbra, develops around an import core. Now, if we place an electrode along the trajectory of that region, so radiating out from the inner penumbra and into normally perfused tissue, what we see is various differences in the baseline electrical activity, which will range from complete silence in the inner and intermediate penumbral zones, right through to normal background activity in the healthy tissue. Now, importantly, in the time after the initial insult, SDs begin to arise spontaneously. Now, they might propagate out in towards normal tissue, where the amount of energy substrate availability is sufficient to enable energy-dependent repolarization, and the depression period that we get is transient and short-lasting. But the problem is they do also propagate inwards through the intermediate penumbral zone into the inner penumbra, where they hit the boundary zone of the core. And because of the very, very restricted energy resources here, and on this pathway towards this periphery of the core region, the depolarization wave becomes increasingly long in duration until the point it does hit that boundary zone, the very inner penumbra. It becomes persistent to the point that it's terminal and the tissue infarcts. And so we see then that SDs exist along a continuum, and effectively what happens is as they reach that inner penumbral zone, the inner penumbra becomes core, the intermediate penumbra becomes inner penumbra, and so on and so forth. And so various characteristics of the SD wave and the background upon which they reside do firstly inform us about what sort of tissue we're actually dealing with here. Are we dealing with penumbral tissue and are SDs going on in the penumbra, or are they going on in more healthy tissue? And it helps inform us how things are evolving over time. And if you get interested in this topic, and it is quite important for understanding how SDs lead to an evolution in the infarct size. There's a really, really nice review on this written by Jed Hartings. And so please go and look that up. And so one question then really is, given that SDs propagate and probably do propagate quite widely, why is it the whole brain doesn't just infarct and kind of dissolve away? And now one of the ways in which the brain, of course, responds to events which are metabolically demanding is that it increases regional cerebral blood flow. And this enables, in response to a depolarization, this compensatory vasodilation allows energy-dependent repolarization and normal activity to return. And that's what happens, we believe, indeed, in healthy tissue. The problem is that in injured tissue, instead of getting vasodilation and hyperemia, we actually get vasoconstriction and severe hypoperfusion. And that is a process that has been referred to as spreading ischemia. And when I say severe hypoperfusion, I really do mean full-on vascular occlusion and just a complete lack of blood flow. We see this illustrated in this video here. As the SD wave comes through, we see this kind of wave of colour, and the vessels are almost completely occluded. And the timeline along the bottom here, this is minutes, this goes on for hours. So what we see with that, really, in actual fact, in terms of the blood flow responses, much like the SD, the electrical characteristics of the SD, is that the blood flow responses also sit along a continuum. So what we get in tissue that is normally perfused is that we get this normal compensatory vasodilation and hyperemia. And at the kind of intermediate penumbra, what we get is this inverse hemodynamic response. We get this vasoconstriction and these type of inverse perfusion responses, blood flow responses. But between these two things, you can imagine it's not a completely dichotomous relationship. And there is, in fact, tissue in between intermediate penumbra and normal. And so, in fact, we also see different types of responses. So between normal and intermediate penumbra, we see these kind of biphasic responses, which consist of principally a primary reduction in cerebral blood flow, which is then followed by a hyperemic response. And interestingly, what we actually see over time is that these biphasic responses, they kind of gradually progress into an inverse response. So in other words, the depth of the initial hypoperfusion begins to increase, and it begins to get longer. And this kind of after hyperemia that we get, that begins to get smaller and disappears until what we've got is just basically principally an inverse response. And then right down at the periphery of the core, we get this kind of permanent decrease in cerebral blood flow. And so if we return to our patient, then in actual fact, a closer representation to reality is somewhat like, is more like this. Out in normally perfused tissue, somewhat ironically and cruelly in a way, we actually see normal vasodilation and hyperemia, and that limits the duration of the depolarization phase and enables normal function to return in relatively speaking, a short time frame. The problem is that in progressively sicker tissue, we see gradually more abnormal responses, which increasingly prolong the duration in combination with those kind of basal levels of flow and metabolite availability that may also be reduced. They increasingly prolong the duration of the depolarization until the point at which the situation becomes terminal. At the innermost penumbral boundary, zone flow levels can drop to those which are consistent with core levels, and the region of severely hypoperfused tissue becomes expanded. And so in this way, then, we see a stepwise recruitment of penumbral tissue into the infarct core, which is closely coupled to the passage of an SD wave. And we also begin to see the initiation of a vicious cycle where poor perfusion can give rise to SDs. SDs cause vasoconstriction in polyperfused tissue. This causes the situation to become worse, which predisposes the cortex to more SDs, and a vicious cycle whips around. And it's nicely illustrated in this image here, where we see a persistent drop to below flow levels below that of the core after just 8 waves and 1 hour of time. And unfortunately, the scary and terrifying thing is that we actually see this happening in real human patients at the patient bedside. And so, as we can see here, originally this SD is coupled with a normal hyperemic response. And as we go on through time, that hyperemia, bearing in mind, of course, that the electrode and the laser Doppler probes, which are recording the cerebral blood flow response, are not moving, they're remaining still. The only thing that's changing is time. So that normal hyperemia is beginning to become biphasic, where we've got an abnormal response to SD. That eventually becomes totally inversed, and then eventually we get this permanent decrease. And so SDs over time then, it's not just something we see experimentally, this is actually something we see in human patients. And there's a nice review on this topic, because this type of permanent decrease here, this is being coupled to delayed neurological deficits in patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage. And so well worth going to have a look at that. And this is all a little bit scary, really. In fact, when we consider that SDs reverberate, cycle, radiate, spiral, converge, diverge, and do all sorts of strange things, as we see in this swine model, and as also illustrated in this EKG recording from a patient, where we see initially the SDs are going one direction, they switch back, go another direction, they somehow split and start going in both directions. They may even make some kind of spirally type of patterns, as we see here. And as I say, they also cycle. And we know that they cycle, not just from experiments, as we can see going on here with this laser speckle imaging, but we know that because there's a very, very fixed interval between SDs in human patient recordings. And so if we get this kind of evolving stepwise increase in perfusion deficit, and this is going on, round and round an infarct core, this is somewhat worrying. And so, as you might imagine, that microvascular vasoconstriction obviously puts a challenge on oxygen availability, among other things. But what we actually see in terms of tissue oxygenation, brain tissue oxygen tension, is that there are principally three types of responses. We get monophasic increases, we get these biphasic responses where we see a primary hypoxic phase followed by a hyperoxic phase, and we see these monophasic decreases. Now, you'll probably notice that, hang on a second, we've seen this before. And in fact, actually, the oxygen responses, the brain tissue oxygen responses to an SD, very much couple and very much look like the regional cerebral blood flow responses. And that is because we know from studies where we looked at brain tissue oxygen tension and gold standard measures of cerebral blood flow, so this is using laser Doppler flowometry, that actually it's the vascular response that determines the net change in brain tissue oxygen tension. And before we even talk about the physiological meanings of that, it does actually have some clinical utility to us, because gold standard measures of cerebral blood flow can be a little bit cumbersome, and they can also be quite expensive. But brain tissue oxygen tension is readily available, it can easily be done, and as we see here, you can place it quite easily into viable tissue next to your EKG electrode. what we see, and I can just tell you from clinical experience really, that monophasic increases, which would probably reflect normal hyperemia, are pretty uncommon. And the commonest type of response that we see are these biphasic or these monophasic decreases in brain oxygenation. And very often what we see is that the hypoxic phase begins to increase, the of your biphasic response, the hyperoxic phase begins to decrease, and eventually we just get monophasic decreases. And so what we can see in this patient here, where we've got clusters of depolarization, so this is the same patient we were looking at a minute ago, where we had SDs cycling. What we can see, in fact, really as I just described, that the main type of response are these monophasic decreases, these hypoxic events, which are lasting quite some time. They're lasting over 10 minutes. And it's not just, in fact, that we're getting these type of very unhelpful reductions in brain tissue oxygen tension, which are transient. They're actually coupled to a baseline reduction in the overall amount of brain oxygenation. And if we drill down a little bit further into this patient's data, what we find is that perfusion pressure is pretty steady around about the 80 mark. So it really, really is the SDs which are driving down brain oxygen here. And this type of picture where we see decreases in the baseline brain oxygenation, coupled with a permanent suppression in the baseline activity up here, would be indicative of spreading ischemia. And so at this point, it might even become possible to speculate that the excessive metabolic demand imposed by an SD, coupled to compromised or even a complete lack of vasoreactivity, has quite a substantial effect on the amount of metabolic substrate which is available. And using an advanced type of microdialysis sampling. So under traditional microdialysis situations, the dialysate is sampled every 1 to 2 hours. And what we in fact did here was use a type of rapid sampling where dialysate is sampled every 30 to 60 seconds. And this is in fact a method that was developed at Imperial College. And what we see using that method, sampling every 30 to 60 seconds, is that time-locked each SD waves a decrease in the glucose. And it's not just that the glucose goes down with each every wave, it's that the basal levels remain persistently decreased and they don't recover back up to where they started. And so this leads very much to a stepwise decrease in glucose availability. Now, this is quite important because glucose is the main energy substrate of the brain, and therefore it's preferentially required to fuel repolarization from an SD. And so this type of depletion of the glycosidic pool severely compromises tissue viability by, in effect, prolonging energy-dependent repolarization, as well as sensitizing the cortex to yet further SD. So it's a little bit like we saw with our perfusion deficit, where poor perfusion gives rise to SDs, SDs cause poor perfusion, and we end up in a vicious cycle. And it's very much the same story with glucose. Now, temperature is a really interesting one, and that begins to transition us now into looking at how SDs interact with other systemic insults. So really, since the first descriptions of SDs, experimental data has shown that core temperature can have a profound effect, both on the number of depolarization events as well as the rate at which they propagate across the cerebral cortex. And in accordance with experimental data, what we find in patients is that the probability of a depolarization occurring increases as a function of rising core temperature, and that temperature in excess of 38 degrees is associated with a depolarization risk of about 63%. And what we also find is exemplified by this individual patient, in which we see hourly core temperatures plotted together with the time at which a depolarization occurred, is that hypothermia is particularly associated with clusters of depolarizations, and that actually anything in excess of 38 degrees, as we see here, if we get the patient under that, in fact, actually those clusters disappear, and we're only left with a few SDs lingering around. And so again, just remembering that it's not just the amount of time that the cells remain depolarized, the number of depolarizations can have an accumulative effect, and that promotes the evolution of the injury. And so temperature and SDs interact in a way which is not entirely favourable to outcome of the patient. In more general terms then, just really out of interest, what we notice is that there is a bit of a difference between brain and body temperature, brain being higher by about half a degree or so. And interestingly, what happens is that during fever, that increase begins to get larger. So brain temperature, in effect, begins to outpace body temperature. And that really leads to the question of why. So as we saw then, that depolarizations, they're much more likely to occur when the brain, when body temperature rises. And the thing is, depolarizations themselves inevitably result in heat production as a consequence of this massive elevation in metabolic workload. And coupled to this, cerebral blood flow, which under normal circumstances would act as an important heat sink, if that becomes simultaneously reduced, then this results in a mismatch between heat production and heat outflow, and what we get is a relative rise in brain temperature. And so what happens then is, of course, it might account, just a speculation, but it may account for why we see this discrepancy at high body temperatures between brain and body temperature, where brain temperature begins to accelerate on that body temperature. And also, importantly, SDs will both sow the seed for their own reproduction, as well as, in effect, amplifying the other consequences of elevated temperature. Now, of course, a lack of appropriate compensatory vasodilation or vasoreactivity is not the only cause of compromised cerebral perfusion. One of the most potent causes is hypertension. And there's actually quite a body of data published out there, including some clinical data. But I really just wanted to show you some of our own data, just because it's an interesting case and really sort of highlights how SDs can be in some way informative about what's going on. And so what we see here is that at maps of 70, the lower boundary of normal, we have a lot of SDs going on, and that the interval between them is pretty short. But actually, if we bump those pressures up to 90, sort of higher end, there's almost complete disappearance of the SDs. Now, this might seem pretty obvious in a patient that's hypertensive and isn't auto-regulating, that you might want to have blood pressure a little bit higher. But this is in fact a patient that turned up from St. elsewhere, as patients do sometimes at major trauma centres, and we didn't really have any history. We didn't know too much about this patient. And so really it's just an interesting example of how SDs at this point are telling you that perfusion is probably not quite sufficient, and that raising blood pressure possibly is beneficial in this particular individual patient. And there's also a good example, of course, of how SDs can both cause a perfusion deficit as well as be caused by them. And so, similarly, then, local consumption as well as regionally insufficiency of glucose is not the only cause of limited glucose availability. Somewhat appreciably, when plasma glucose falls below around about the 8 millimole mark, the incidence of SDs begins to rise linearly. Now, in more general terms, glucose availability shares a paradoxical relationship with patient outcome, wherein both hyper and hypoglycemia correlate with poor outcome. And what we notice is that the intersect on this graph is probably at the higher end of normal. And I'm not in any way trying to advocate that we should be making patients hyperglycemic, but it is just interesting to note there's a tight glycemic control is somewhere down in this region. And so one does wonder perhaps if whether management of plasma glucose guided by SD monitoring and wherever possible in conjunction with cerebral microdialysis might promote better outcomes overall, since that would allow for a more personalised and time-varying approach to glucose control. And so hypoxia then, again, as we saw, brain tissue oxygen tension, SDs lead to a reduction in oxygen availability, and that local vasoconstriction, of course, can cause hypoxia, particularly if we think about it in the context of the fact that SDs are extremely metabolically demanding. But in terms of hypoxia, again, of course, local causes are not the only factor. This can happen systemically, and in correspondence with experimental data. Again, I just really wanted to show you some of our own clinical data. So this was a patient that we recorded only a couple of months ago. Young chap who had chest fractures and developed a mucus plug in the trachea. He desaturated all the way down to 59%, was it? Yes, 59%. As you could probably see, hopefully if I move my mouse along here, so our desaturation, as you might very well expect, EEG kind of becomes a bit sparse, goes a bit flat, and right on cue we see an SD. Now this is a patient that hadn't otherwise been having SDs, and so again we see the interaction that SDs have with other systemic insults. So in a way, they themselves can cause tissue oxygenation to fall, but they can also be promoted by hypoxia, and so a vicious cycle again develops. So just to summarise then, SDs inflict their damage and create a nasty positive feedback loop by increasing metabolic demand, which leads to a fall in brain glucose, increased oxygen utilisation, and a rise in brain temperature. Now, coupled to this is a reduction in metabolite supply resulting from the inverse hemodynamic response that we particularly see in penumbral sick tissue. And this leads to a reduction in oxygen supply, as well as a fall in perfusion and a state of spreading ischemia. This only serves to add yet further strain on already compromised energy resources, as well as a struggle to regulate brain temperature, all of which will set the scene for yet more SDs. And thus, this becomes a nasty, self-sustaining vicious cycle, which over time can progressively increase the infarct volume, even if nothing else is going on in the patient. The problem is that if systemic blood flow, blood glucose, or oxygenation or indeed if core temperature should rise for any other reasons, then what we find is that we get an acceleration of this cycling, and we're much more likely at this point to begin to see clusters. Now, if all of this is not bad enough, as an immediate consequence of the massive influx of sodium and calcium inherent to the depolarization, water is osmotically driven into the cell, causing rapid development of cytotoxic edema. And within a couple of days, we begin to see the effects of blood-brain barrier opening and development of vasogenic edema. And this gives rise to late rises in ICP. And over time, this leads eventually to cell death. All in all then, it's not absolutely surprising that we find SDs, in particular those that are frequent, of long duration, or allied to electrical silence, or in other words, they're going on in penumbral tissue, are an independent predictor of poor outcome. And moreover, the addition of SDs to the 6-month predictive outcome model increased the amount of variance in outcome that could be explained by the 7-variable impact model from 9 to 22%. And so what we find here is that we have a pretty bleak picture going on with SDs and how they lead to an evolution in the injury and poor outcome. But in fact, all is not lost, because what we can do is in fact monitor the patient, and we can see these electrical characteristics of the SD which sit along our cellular wellness scale. And so by monitoring the SDs and their various blood flow and oxygen responses, together with the effects that they have on metabolite supply, we can actually stand a better chance of decreasing the secondary injury that occurs commonly in patients following trauma and major vascular events. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And please get your questions ready for the live session. Use the Q&A tab on your screen. While you're doing that, Dr. Rodriguez will provide a brief overview of our involvement in spreading depolarizations and specifically Sharon's neuromonitoring program.
Hi, I'm Anna Rodriguez, Director of Research at Moberg ICU Solutions, and I would like to highlight how our system is truly designed to support the comprehensive research and clinical use of low potential EEG monitoring, such as spreading depolarizations. Our CNS Advanced ICU amplifier was developed with the guidance of members of the COSBIC group and has become the preferred device for recording spreading depolarizations in many of the world's leading research institutions. Our CNS monitor, which has FDA clearance and CE mark, records and processes continuous EEG, and it integrates it with data from many other devices, such as brain oxygen, ICP, and microdialysis. And last but not least, we offer CNS Envision as review software for the analysis and annotation of the multimodal data recorded with the CNS monitor. It offers specialized displays for showing SDs, including long time scales and dual filters, along with the ability to view SDs synchronized with the other physiology that's recorded with the CNS monitor. Here is an example of the use of our platform for the recording and visualization of spreading depolarizations. This case has been kindly provided by Dr. Brandon Foreman from the University of Cincinnati. The patient was a 57-year-old man with multiple contusions, a traumatic subarachnoid hemorrhage, and a subdural hematoma after a fall. He quickly deteriorated after admission, and the ICP was refractory. Spreading depolarizations appeared in the death recordings within the first 12 hours of admissions, and by displaying the death recordings on a long time scale and filtering them to separate the high frequency content, here in black, from the low frequency content, here in red, we can truly appreciate the concurrent depression and depolarization. Also, the integrated displays in CNS Envision clearly show the effects of the spreading depolarizations on PbTO2 and perfusion. Since much of the recent research in the field has made clear the importance of detecting and treating spreading depolarizations, we are also working in collaboration with King's College to offer their automatic SD detector, as shown by Dr. Jewell, as an addition to our platform. If anyone is interested in learning more about this, please get in contact with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So once again, please send in your questions, and we'll now go live to Sharon in London for our Q&A session. And I want to again thank Sharon for her presentation. She has an amazing way to make difficult topics extremely clear. So let's see if we can get Sharon in here.
Hello.
Hi, Sharon.
Oh, hi. Hello. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, I think everything's good. So why don't you just start going through the questions and answering. Thanks.
Sure. So we've got. Let me just check here. We did have a couple of chat questions there. I'm just going to have a look here. So one question that we've had, and I think this is another one that sort of replicates that, is talking about EEG, surface EEG, and I think that's a question we get asked commonly. Where are we at with detecting SDs non-invasively? And I think the short answer is that it can be done. And we've been working on this for a little while now. And certainly I know that the group in Cincinnati, led by Jed Hastings, they're very much on this road as well, along with the group led by Jens Dreyer. So I think there's a few of us that are working on this at the moment. But the thing is, it's not a sort of straight one-for-one. It's not, so you put EEG electrodes on and you just see slow potential change and depression, and it's all just a bit smaller and a bit less. The waveforms that you get are a little bit different. And so certainly for us, we're sitting on a bit of a gold mine of SDs on the surface. But we're in the process of just trying to really describe the EEG phenomena so that when we publish it, it's really clear to everybody else. I think one of the things that's happened that's hard for us as well as scientists and researchers in this field is that we began with ECOG, and now we're trying to go from this incredibly sensitive measure to something that's actually not that sensitive, which is EEG. And of course, that's not what happened in the normal EEG world, and EEG is often used in epilepsy. And what happened in that scenario is that people used EEG and then used ECOG and sort of thought, oh, look what we've been missing. But it is kind of gone the other way around for us. So now we know how much we get. We're sort of struggling to go back out to a less sensitive measure. But bear with us, because we're certainly nearly there. And for sure, some flash of brilliance will come from Cincinnati at some moment. So do follow us, because we'll come out with that. The other possibility that will happen with non-invasive detection is this blood flow, measuring blood flow response, and that can be done with near-infrared spectroscopy. And there are a few studies that have shown promise for that, so that could be another method. So what other questions have we got here? So how much training do epileptologists need to monitor SDs? To be honest, very little. I mean, I've come from epilepsy and into SD monitoring, and just the sheer size of it, for a start, is just so much larger and longer than anything that you see in terms of epileptic seizures. And I've been caught out a number of times. You know, seizures are hard. They can happen on one electrode. They can range anything from high amplitude spike wave activity through to low amplitude diffuse fast activity. This just isn't what happens with SDs. You get this large negative slow potential change, you get a depression, or not, because it may go on in isoelectric tissue, but either way it's very clear when you see it. It's typically very stereotyped. So in terms of training, very, very little. The thing that you really need is a decent amplifier. And to be perfectly honest, the Moberg amplifier is the best amplifier I've ever used. So that's key, really, to be able to monitor SDs. So another question about how long might you see an SD after a desaturation? And that's a really interesting question, actually. It's probably pretty immediate. But it's something that I noticed I didn't say during the presentation is that the rate of propagation of SDs is incredibly slow. I mean, spreading is almost an exaggerated term. It's more like crawling or creeping, because they only go about 2 to 7 millimeters a minute. So it could probably take anything up to an hour. It depends where you put your electrode. However, if you've got your electrode over the penumbral tissue, that's most likely where the SDs are going to initiate. But I would allow an hour easily from an event like that. I've certainly seen this temperature the same. Temperature will go up, and then it'll be half an hour or an hour before you start seeing that reflected. So that's one thing. What else do we have here? Let's have a quick scroll down. Well, I had another. Oh, there was something about ketamine, actually. I'm just going to go back to the ketamine. what do we think about the role of ketamine? Well, this is another really, really interesting one. And I will tell you this because I've presented this data, although it's unpublished. So it's really easy to elicit depolarizations. They can be caused by high extracellular glutamate. However, they can also be caused by numerous other things. And certainly high extracellular potassium is a big promoter of depolarizations. And so what happens in ischemic tissue is that the NMDA receptors are actually incredibly sensitive to pH, and they shut down effectively when the tissue becomes very, very ischemic. They don't like low pH. So the thing that causes depolarizations in your sick ischemic tissue is almost certainly high potassium and not high glutamate. However, what's causing them to come about in other areas where the tissue is not quite so ischemic, but might have a lot of neurotransmitters lingering around in the system, may well be glutamate. And so when you give ketamine, you'll probably be protecting most of the brain. But whether you're actually protecting the sick penumbra is another question, really. And certainly we have used multiple electrodes, and when we've put electrodes in near the core, where presumably the mechanisms are potassium, and we put electrodes out in the sort of more healthy tissue where at least in part the SDs are being promoted by high glutamate, what you see when you give ketamine is that it is very effective at protecting the brain, most of the brain, but it's probably not that great at protecting the area around the core. In terms of ketamine, I think in terms of use of ketamine, if you've got very resistant depolarizations going on, I mean, it's difficult, really. I certainly wouldn't want to give any advice about giving ketamine, but there does come a point where we're, certainly as a group, we're going to probably try to address that question ourselves at some point. Relationship between seizures and SDs. Yes, what we see with seizures and SDs, well, first of all, so we have, just to put some numbers on this, really, so it's again something I didn't really have time to talk about in the talk. So in terms of trauma, we're talking about 56% of patients, and that ranges all the way up to about 98% of patients with malignant hemispheric stroke. And so they're quite a lot more common, and certainly from our own data set. So we have 180 patients, and we have a grand total of 7 with seizures, and we have 83% overall. So we monitor all patients, trauma, all types of stroke. And so they're much more common. That's the first thing. In terms of how they interact with one another is that certainly depolarizations can abort seizures, which is interesting and probably accounts for, to some extent, why you see seizures build up and die down and build up and die down under certain conditions. But what we always find is that if there are seizures, there are SDs. You don't really get seizures and no SDs. Just purely out of interest. In terms of chicken and the egg, do SDs promote seizures? I'm not sure I've seen that. I wouldn't want to. There's certainly a relationship there, but I don't think that depolarizations promote them. Seizures may well make the brain a bit more excitable in terms of you then going on to have SDs. That's more of a possibility. Anything else? What else have we got here? They're really the main questions, actually. I think there's a few repeats. Yeah, a lot of questions about ketamine and non-invasive detection. So one question we have about, do all patients with head injuries and SDs develop brain pyrexia? The answer is it probably depends on how many depolarizations they're getting. So if they are getting a lot of depolarizations, the chances, and it depends what type of blood flow response they're getting. So if you're getting a lot of depolarizations and they're coupled to vasoconstriction, microvascular vasoconstriction, you're going to get a rise in temperature. There's just no other way of that happening. And so one of the sort of interesting things about temperature, of course, is that if you've got a body temperature that's getting above 38 degrees, your risk of a depolarization is becoming really, really high, at which point your body temperature is underestimating your brain temperature. That's it, really, I think.
Well, thank you, Sharon. And I want to particularly thank Sharon because she just informed us that her brother is getting married tomorrow. And it's incredible dedication that she would spend the evening before that doing this webinar. So thank you very much. And thanks to all of our viewers. And we'll see you at our next webinar.
Great. Thanks very much.